So Christo, how long have you been working on this conversion now? It's been a few years, hasn't it? It's quite a long journey.
4 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And were you flying the flowers from Nairobi before?
Yeah, still.
So how much difference is the transit time to the port then, to your overall?
Let's say when you transport flowers by air, it takes around 3 days from harvest till marketplace in the Netherlands. And by ocean, it's 28 days.
Okay. Yeah. And the turnouts with CA, controlled atmosphere, the turnouts the same?
No, just very good post-harvest protocols, really following them up, and a good cold chain. So when we transport the reefers from, so we stuff the reefer in Nairobi, you have to transport them for around 20 hours to Mombasa. We use like 2 generators, a clip-on and an underslung, so we have backup systems. So we've got all those kind of measures in place.
So, because as you can see, it's a really interesting business that they're involved in. And the other thing that, as somebody that's done a lot of work in Africa, I like about their business model is that the grower gets to sell his products in Europe and realize the European value from his products because they've moved them through the supply chain, whereas in a lot of other sea transports, the grower has to sell his products locally and only gets a local price for his product. So getting European values from the product for the Kenyan growers is a big advantage. So message from Christo, if you want to get on well with your carriers, you need a nice light blue suit this afternoon. A number of things occurred to me from the things that are being said in terms of the service levels that people are looking for now and e-platforms. I mean, the way in which we do business together is really changing, but the terms and conditions on the back of the bill of lading haven't really changed for the last 100 years, and we still have to get to grips with things like the Hague-Visby rules. Perhaps it's really time that we rewrite the legal contractual relationship between shippers and carriers because it is so far out of date. When you listen to the 10-point wish list that was being asked for earlier on. I'd just like to leave that thought with you. And I've got one question for Philip with your 10-point list of service requirements. How much value does that have, and would you be prepared to pay your carriers more for that as an incentive for them to deliver those service levels?
Yes, but not too much.
Form an orderly queue. Okay. Without further ado, who'd like to ask the first question? Please do take a microphone and tell us who you are and who you work for. A question over here.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Rutger Heijster. I'm working for Maersk Line here in the Netherlands. So I'm indeed working for a carrier. I thought maybe some words of defense, so to say, indeed, for all the remarks that were placed on our behalf, what we have to do. I think all the gentlemen, especially Mr. van der Meer, is our customers from our company. So thank you for all the feedback, basically, that you provided us, how we can better our services. I even took a picture of Mr. De Groot's, his 10 points. And it came a little bit to my attention that there's an awful lot of investments that we have to make as a carrier, whereas I'm missing a little bit the commitment from the customer side. I think we as a carrier realize that our product is commoditizing. The hardware product from shipping goods from A to B is not really the thing anymore that we can differentiate ourselves with. It's more the softer items, such as good inland connections, a good customer service representative, timely BL issue, all those softer items. That's where we as Maersk, I think we can really differentiate ourselves. I think as a shipper you can make very good agreements with Maersk, for example. But my question to you is, how can we invest a lot in customers that are each year tendering their business again in an all-in or nothing approach? So you want me to make a lot of investments, whereas you also force us to only focus on the rate and after a year just give away all of our business. So I'm a little bit yeah, my question to you is how do you see this? This approach of tendering your business using online tools, of measuring rates only. How does that cope with the 10 points list, for example, of Mr. De Grote?
Okay. Thanks very much for that. And perhaps I'd just like to come back to, before I ask the panel to answer, a comment made by Victor earlier on when he said that when the container becomes a commodity, the shipper no longer controls the price. But with that in mind, who'd like to go first? Okay. Yes, Tommy.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting point related to this was we were just running an ocean freight tender globally at Goodyear. And we were trying to give long-term, multi-year, more like a partnership approach with some of the big carriers. And the answer was very interesting. It's like, yeah, thank you very much. We appreciate that you want to do multiple years of business, but the base price is higher for the year 2 and year 3. So it's a little bit difficult to understand that today you have a base price of X, and then we agree on an indexation method, that if the market situation changes, then the price is, of course, indexed, which is normal. But why would I need to pay extra on the base price if I want to have a multi-year contract? So the same behavior from the carriers is driving us to think purely a 12-month period. But we would be happy to do 3-year, 4-year long-term contracts with key partners, if you will, or key players at least, in the industry if it made sense.
Okay, and who else would like to respond to that? Philip.
I have no problem to answer. We were also doing a global RFQ. I have to tell you, 2 years ago, Stanley Black & Decker was 100% forwarder business, where now we go more to a carrier direct business. But unfortunately, Maersk doesn't want to quote, so I can't answer on your question if I would do a long-term contract with you.
Interesting. Okay. Victor, have you got anything you'd like to add?
Yes, we used to tender on the transatlantic westbound for 2 years instead of the annual contract what we have to the rest of the world. This year we changed it back to 1 year. And what we see, the dynamics in the market, they change more often than the old days. So the alliances. So if we now go back to 2 years ago and look to the profile of the transatlantic westbound or transatlantic trade, the environment changed a lot. We saw the strikes on the west coast, the chassis issues, so the on-carriage that became more expensive for carriers, and new alliances that were not there 2 years ago, and some other carriers that exit the trade. So even when, from our side, we were able to make the right forecast and had long annual, yearly or longer term contracts with our end customers, the situation on the container market changed drastically. And what we see on our side when we have a contract or the base rate fixed for a longer period and the spot market goes up, then we're running into space and equipment issues with those carriers. So I think, and when the market goes down and we need to offer on the spot market to end customers, you can also say that our competitiveness will decrease. So it can only happen, the long-term contracts, when actually the compliance is high. And then I also don't have a problem to commit for 3 or 5 years, taking some variable costs like bunker that we keep floating and set the base for a longer period, not an issue. But for now, the compliance is low and very much depends on the spot market, how the service level actually is.
Thank you very much. So I think the answer to your question is there is an interest in negotiating long-term contracts, whether it's 2 years or 3 years, but there's an acceptance that the marketplace is very dynamic and trying to cover all the bases, the way you might be affected is quite complicated, and that long-term contracts work where compliance levels are high. So I hope that answers your question. Let's move on to the next question, please. The gentleman over here in the blue shirt.
Thanks. James Frost, Marinova Consulting in Halifax, Canada. I have a question. I'll start with Tommy. In terms of shipment visibility, does it make the most sense to have the carrier do this, the terminal operator do this, or indeed a port to do this? I'm working on a small project where a port is going to develop a dashboard. Which would be your preference? And perhaps the other panelists can answer as well.
Thanks, James. So it really for us, for the perspective of understanding that where the cargo is and what's the status, it really doesn't matter where and who would input the information as such. So what we are trying to envision is a portal type of solution that we can, as a shipper, log online and see the status, whether it's maintained by the forwarder, whether it's maintained by the carrier, or whether even the ports add some comments or information, especially disruptions. It's kind of we're completely neutral to that. I mean, the key thing is to have the information. And I just tell you a little story. I live in Luxembourg, recently moved back to Europe after being 15 years outside. I order a taxi. You have an online taxi service in Luxembourg. Of course, they are ridiculously expensive, like everything in Luxembourg. But anyway, so once you get a taxi booking confirmation, they send you an email or SMS or even a tweet if you want about the taxi and an online link to a map that exactly pinpoints the GPS location of the taxi and updates every 30 seconds the ETA. So I don't need to stand outside waiting for it. And I actually get a picture of the taxi as well, what color, what make, model car it is. So it's nice. Whether everything you need this type of service is of course, a big question, but it definitely helps me as a customer.
Good analogy. Does that answer your question? More or less. Okay. Talk to him afterwards. Okay, can we have our next question, please? Okay, well, I was expecting a little bit more robustness from you, the carriers, this afternoon. If you've got any more comments, please, we'll give you one final chance, and we're just going to hand over to Mike Cashman, who's just raised his hand.
Hi. So, you guys are all valued customers of the global shipping lines. And so Steve said, not me, because they're all my customers here as well. But Steve said that the shipping lines took a bit of a bashing throughout the presentation, except one. But what's going to really drive change? Now, this is not the first time we hear this. My colleague said to me, this situation is not getting any better. But the issues still keep coming up year after year. Sorry, I've been around too long. But what actually finally is going to drive change? Because the shippers, you are the customer, and the customer is king, at least in our company. But what really can you do to drive change, to get the service that you require?
I mean, that's potentially quite an expensive piece of consultancy to answer that question. I think you've asked there, Mike. But while the panel think about that, whether they're prepared to give that for free, I have a horrible suspicion that the only thing that's really going to make a big difference is when we see a return to the balance with supply and demand. And whilst we're stuck in this position with oversupply, and the business has become commoditized, and the comment was that shippers are no longer in control of the freight rates, then it's going to be very difficult for there to be any change until that supply-demand balance changes and things move back in the other direction. But having said that, I'll ask if any of our panel would like to have a crack at answering that question.
Well, if I may, Steve, I don't know if I really have the exact answer to that question, but what I do know for flowers, that shipping them by ocean is 30 to 40% cheaper right now than shipping them by air. We need the price difference, I believe, of at least 25%. So we're getting to that. So in order to keep ocean as a serious modality or alternative to air freight, prices you don't want them to go up. Also from a carrier's perspective, once you have invested in that corridor. That's step one, but I think that's different for my colleagues here on the stage. And then the only thing that is left, I guess, is to look at the supply chain really integral. So look at the total cost of ownership, in our case, of bringing a rose from Kenya to Europe. And there's a lot of parties involved. There's a lot of processes and documents involved. And there's a whole lot of costs that can be saved there when you look at it integrally. But I think because there is this huge amount of parties involved, and then I'm only talking about one carrier, but these guys over here, you deal with 30 carriers or something. There's just too many, I guess, to look at it at an integral perspective. But once you have one specific corridor which you can focus on, I think that's really the next step. And then you can easily bring integral supply chain costs down with 20, 30, 40%. I'm convinced of that. But yeah, it needs a few steps before we get to that point. But that's, in the end, that's the only way forward.
Very interesting answer, Christo. Coming back to looking at the total supply chain, end-to-end. Toby.
Yeah, I mean, generally I would say that when you want to drive change, you need to give a choice. So if you only sell one product and with one price, then okay, that's it. But if you offer wider services and choices on that with different price tags, then the marketplace and the customers would choose more what's important for them. That's of course easier said than done. Like if you just say, I have an express service now, but it costs 50% more, how many customers would switch? Well, my friend with flowers would switch for the express service because he's still getting a saving compared to air freight. With me, with a big, bulky, black, round product, which is cheap and heavy, I wouldn't because I can't afford it. So that's one, maybe the easy answer. The second point is that if you truly drive closer to a partnership or good collaboration, a better relationship between the customer and the supplier, first of all, you need trust. But if you do that, like I've done with some of my warehousing and trucking companies, you go more open book. And if we go more open book and we're willing to share the cost bases and things and jointly then collaborate and find ideas of how to take cost out of the total chain, we are very happy to share that saving with the partner. And as long as you keep everything closed, then there is no opportunity because there's no trust.
Yeah, thanks, Tomi.
We are, from a manufacturing standpoint, we look always to processes. And let's be honest, we are all consumers. A consumer doesn't want to pay more year over year. Consumer goods are getting less expensive, and it has to come somewhere in the supply chain. So where we are looking from on a long term is a partnership with, I take for example, carriers, and to look where can we take profit out or where can we take cost out of the process by doing things leaner. If I go in and every office of a carrier or a forwarder, it's an army of people. What I'm always wondering, oh my God, what are all those people doing 10 hours per day? So it looks like it is still a lot of administration instead of, in the modern world, with all the technology solutions we have, it looks like we missed the boat from an IT perspective in the industry, in the shipping industry. And in addition, also collaboration. If you look from shippers, ports, authorities, or the port hinterland solutions, barge terminals, everybody is working in his silo and nothing is really over the whole supply chain. So I think there is also a lot of room of improvement.
Thanks very much. Victor, do you want to add anything to that?
I think most has been said. What we're looking at is to measure carriers on their KPI performance. So we actually share what we believe are important service aspects, and where we eventually also take that into account in the decision making for the nominations of a annual tender. So you can say you can rank carriers or categorize them, and depending maybe on the product or the commodity, one carrier works best for the total cost. Because if we also take the incidents where we need to air freight the product to arrive in time to prevent a plant from shutting down, demurrage cost, even worse, losing a customer, an end customer that tell, hey, you didn't organize your transport and logistics in the right way. So that's where we see the impact. So that's again where we also measure carriers on, and that's something what we share with carriers that we work with on a quarterly basis, and we hope to get a constructive discussion how we can come up with action points to improve the service. But yeah, you can do that on a local level, on a central level, but I think throughout the whole organization of a shipping line need to be conscious of that and be supported. So also say, well, we can invest another $1 billion in new vessels, or we can invest 1/10 of that amount in our customer service with a better return.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm going to draw the session to a close now because I think this is a really good place to end. Well placed last question, Mike. Thank you very much for that. I mean, the industry keeps doing the same things. There's a saying that if you keep repeating the same thing, expecting the outcome to be different, apparently it's the first sign of madness. Hopefully it's not quite that bad yet, but clearly we need to do something different. And what's been interesting from the session this afternoon was that Philip very honestly said he listed his 10-point list of service requirements that he wanted, and he said he'd be prepared to pay a little bit more for that. So, thanks for that, for your honesty. That's really interesting. There's been a request for a data repository, a number of requests about making the transfer of data through the supply chain more automated and looking at the total supply chain. And I think that's really important, looking at the total supply chain and automating the movement of data through it. Lots of requests for proactive communication. Every speaker came up with that. I do raise the question about whether it's time to change the contract terms because they're out of date, i.e. repeating the same thing and expecting the outcome to be different. And this issue about long-term contracts is a combination of compliance, communication, and trusting the partner that you're actually working with. But perhaps whilst the carriers work together in these large global alliances and are unable to differentiate themselves until they reach a point where the market changes and they can split out and operate on their own, should they wish to, maybe it's only then that they'll start to be able to differentiate themselves with their own different service levels. I don't know the answer, but perhaps a good idea to leave the session this afternoon with an unanswered question. Before we get to the point of saying thank you to the speakers, I've got a little note here that says that we're invited to a launch ceremony on the Libya stand at 3 o'clock this afternoon. That might be something to do during the coffee break. But to bring the session to a close, thank you for your questions this afternoon. I think it's been really interesting a discussion that we've had, and thank you very much to the speakers who produced a lot of really interesting information. So our thanks to Victor, to Christo, to Tommy, and to Philip, and I've been your moderator, Steve Cameron. Thank you very much.